Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm here with returning guest, Shelby Roy Hopkins. How you doing?
I'm just fine.
Good. We're sitting here in your living room and going to talk about some Dripping Springs Hotel, right? Give us a little overview, I guess, of Dripping Springs, where it was located, and that sort of stuff. Who started it?
Dripping Springs is a mineral well or mineral springs that comes splashing out of the mountain. It's in the corner of Garrard County, just across Fall Lick Creek from Lincoln County. It's about 200 yards from Lincoln County. It was much more closely affiliated with Crab Orchard than it was ever in Lancaster, even though Lancaster was its county seat. It was handier and easier access to go to Dripping Springs from Crab Orchard than it was. And most of their advertising was done in the Interior Journal, the Stanford Interior Journal newspaper, through the years. And it one time was a booming place, like a lot of these little springs were. People went there because the water was pure. They thought the minerals in it was good for their health. And you have to realize a lot of people were drinking from contaminated water sources back in those days. They drank from creeks, they drank from polluted wells, they drank from in the ditches sometimes. And to have a source of water like that was so pure and clean, it really helped people. And with the poor water people were drinking, they were subjecting themselves to parasites and disease of all kinds, and things such as typhoid, things like that. This water comes flowing out of the mountain. The earliest recollection I can read about was in 1795. Mm-hmm. There were men there getting water in 1790. Some of the earliest settlers in the state of Kentucky, of course. It's never gone dry, as far as I know. Originally, they say there were two springs there, but one of those springs caved in somewhere along the line, long time ago. But the one spring is in danger of caving in. It's the supports it's holding, the ledge of the rock ledge that where the water comes pouring out of are getting weaker, and it wouldn't take much of a seismic shift to move it and to collapse it. But there's a huge vein of water. It flows out typically about 2 inches in a hose, in a plastic hose, and it's been flowing all my life, and ever since at least 1795.
Yeah, would that have been the Craigs' time, whenever it was, or a little bit?
The Craigs, they came to Garrard County, but there's no mention of them being at Dripping Springs.
Okay.
There's no mention of the Craigs being at Dripping Springs, and I've got some few facts here. I'll share it with you. There was they built a resort there in the early 1800s, and the earliest known thing I know for sure was in 1842. In the June 22nd, 1888 edition of the semi-weekly Interior Journal, S.W. Givens is described as having visited Dripping Springs for 46 years. His first visit would have been in 1842. There are lots of historical documents about the place, and including J.W. Newland of Garrard County says he's been visiting Dripping Springs for 30 years. That would have been 1855, his first visit. D.R. Moore of Shelby City, today's Junction City, states he's been visiting Dripping Springs for the last 15 years, since 1870. Dripping Springs was just a little local resort, and people would flock to it, like I said, and they would spend their summers there. Mm-hmm. They would spend their summers there. Typically, these resorts is open from about June through September, and that's typical.
Yeah, and so, and to give you some more reference, I mean, you had Crab Orchard Springs Hotel, which was pretty close. Mm-hmm. Other hotels and stuff around Crab Orchard as well, but I guess that was kind of a vacation spot. These were vacation spots for people, and they were, sprouted up everywhere. I don't know any statistics, but there used to be mineral springs all over the place. Those have probably run dry or as been collapsed as they go. But Bath County is named after the mineral springs, the Bath Springs in its area. So something that you would find a lot of back in the day, and people use those as tourist attractions and hotels, like you said, for sickness and so forth. People would come to they would think they were getting some healing factors from the minerals and so forth and all that kind of stuff. Which what kind of what was it, sulfur or what was it? What was in
The
the?
water, it does have a kind
It's a
of
hard
sulfur.
water, right?
Yeah, it's made up of 7 different ingredients. There's iron and there's different. I don't know all the different things right now. I don't have a list of it right now. I've read it before. But there was a lot of different minerals inside the water, and of course we know mineral water is still good for you. It's still,
Yeah.
There are people today that still go to that little enclave and they take plastic jugs and they fill them up with water and they insist on drinking that water. And it's absolutely clean and pure. It's coming out of the mountains, coming out of the earth, and there'd never be a reason to need to boil it or anything like that. That's just not necessary. You can't talk about Dripping Springs though without bringing forth the key character. There was a man named Daniel Garrard Slaughter, and he started taking care of. He leased Dripping Springs from the owners in the early 1880s.
Yeah.
Daniel Garrard Slaughter was a relative of James Garrard, one of the early governors of Kentucky, and also his grandfather Slaughter, Gabriel Slaughter, was one of the So he came from a wealthy family. Dan Slaughter was married and had 4 children, but he still was somewhat of a ladies' man, even though he was wealthy and he was an outstanding entrepreneur. He promoted heavily Dripping Springs, and of course by the 70s and early 1880s, railroads had come into vogue. In the United States after the Transcontinental Railroad was built, communication was available. Things that happened in Dripping Springs, and I will talk about that in just a minute, today would be reported in the San Francisco Chronicle tomorrow. We have a hard time realizing that. Now we have instantaneous news, but back in those days, it seemed to me that would be foreign, but it wasn't. There was lots of travel. There was lots of trains. And one thing I find really interesting, in January 15th, 1886 edition of the Stanford paper, Dan Slaughter has ordered 20,000 12-page folders advertising Dripping Springs.
Wow.
Now, 20,000 12-page folders. That's a lot today.
Yeah.
What he would do with those folders, he, of course, would be well-dressed, and he had money. He would go to Lebanon. He would go to Lexington on the train. He would ride to Louisville on the train. And when he met someone smartly dressed or looked like successful in some way, give him a folder. Come to Dripping Springs. It's a place to go. At Dripping Springs, there was a hotel, and it had 2 stories, and it had porches, covered porches that wrapped all the way around the building. At the back, in the middle of the first floor, was a ballroom for dancing, and if you walked out the back of the ballroom, there was a deck, and you walked out of that deck, and a grown man could walk into the cavern where Dripping Springs came out of the wall. Inside the cavern, they had hewn out of the sandstone rocks troughs, and those troughs, the water ran out of the wall, out of the pipe in the wall. It ran down into those troughs, and they filled the troughs with butter and milk and eggs and things such as that. And the water continuously ran over, that cold water coming out of the mountain continuously ran over these items that need to be refrigerated, keeping it sparkling cold. They had a great big hole in the middle of the floor. It protected where you wouldn't fall into it, but it was as big as a barrel. And inside that barrel was, of course, inside this hole was water flowing in and overflowing all the time. And they put watermelons in there. And they could put, 20 watermelons in there at any given time. And then they were fresh and crispy. The water then, the excess water flowed underneath the deck, coming off the back of the hotel. And then people would dance on the deck. And they said it was air conditioned long before anything had ever been invented. There was a lady from, we'll get back to Dan Slaughter in a minute. There was a lady from Lancaster, and she taught French at, her name was Jane Haselden. She taught French at the University of Kentucky. She had a master's or doctorate degree from University of Kentucky. She's one of the first female pilots in the country. She was born in early 1900s, I think 1901. She lived to late 1970s. But in 1977, she did an oral transcript of what life was like at Dripping Springs, because her family would go there in the summer. her daddy would take them, or they would ride in with their servants, would take them up there in wagons, and her mom and her siblings and her, and they would stay at Dripping Springs. Well, their daddy would come. His name was J.R. Hassel, and he ran a very successful hardware business in Lancaster. He would come up there and stay on the weekends. So she had I transcribed that oral message into paper one time. It's about 12 pages, and she gives in great detail all the aspects of Dripping Springs.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That would. Do you have any way of sharing that? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, that would be really cool to read, because those first-hand accounts are
yes,
very cool.
She remembered this, and so back to Dan Slaughter. We'll get back to Miss Hazelton again in a minute, but she gives a lot of information about that, and Dripping Springs is important to me because my daddy was born there in 1926. My grandfather would buy that property in 1919 and move from Lincoln County to Garrard County. But before we get to that part of the history, 1886, these little places, they had a tendency to sometimes be violent because people were, just like today, people would drink and carouse, and women were involved. And so March 18th, 1886, Dan Slaughter, in self-defense, kills John Baker, a colored man at Dripping Springs. They determined it was self-defense. In April 30th, 1886, Dan Slaughter reports that the ballroom has just been completed. These buildings were made of wood, and they didn't last very long. Wood decays pretty rapidly. Now we have brick, and we have stone, and we have vinyl siding and things such as that. Back when you have wood, it didn't last too long, so they constantly had to be updated. They didn't hold paint very well, and so they had to be updated. And so in May 28th, 1886, Dan Slaughter states that the buildings are all completed and that 500 gallons of paint were used to paint them. He states the buildings are white with red and green trim. And the red and green trim, that would be the little slats they put over the cracks in the boards. The boards stood from top to bottom, straight up and down, vertical. And they would put slats over those, and they would paint those slats sometimes a different color. And so red and green, this would stand out.
Yeah.
Because when you drive up on Dripping Springs, you're in the country. I mean, you're on a gravel road, and if you came from Crab Orchard, it would be about probably 6 miles from Crab Orchard. You would head out 39 like you do now, and then you would get to Fall Lick Road, Highway 3246, and at the bridge at the base of the Kennedy Hill, you would leave the road. The road did not go any farther, and you would drive into, or with your horse and buggy or whatever you had, later on cars, you would drive into Fall Lick Creek. And Jane Haselton says that you would drive into the creek for a bit and then veer up to the right and then drive on the roadside for a little bit, then back into and you would cross the creek 21 times. And when you came out of the creek, finally, there's Dripping Springs, there at the base of the mountain. Okay, there's a big bottom at the base of the mountain. It's real level, but the mountain itself is quite tall. It's one of the taller mountains there in that area. But anyway, so that's what you would ride. And so this white buildings, and with 500 gallons of paint, with red and green trim, would be something to see.
Yeah.
June 29th, Dan Slaughter states that this ballroom will hold 500 people. This is a big building, okay?
Yeah. That's a lot. Well, going back a little bit, you mentioned how the water ran out, and I mean, this is a bit of engineering too. I mean, to have it all set up to where it can keep things refrigerated.
I remember the troughs whenever Daddy's family owned it, and they were just sandstone rock is pretty easy to carve, and these troughs were deep. They would be probably 18 inches deep, plenty enough to engulf a big can or jar of milk or whatever you want to do. And the water was always real, real cold. Like I said, real, real clean. So in the 1880s, Dan Slaughter, we talked about 1886, advertised the place. The governor of Kentucky, there was the hotel, and then there was 3 cottages. There was one at the base of the mountain, just up a little bit from the hotel. There was one halfway up, and there was one on top. And so the top cottage was called the governor's cottage. He would come there, different governors would come there, and to get away from Frankfurt and to get away from politics for a little while. And they would come there, and he would go to the top where he would be less likely to be disturbed by people, he and his family. And there was a croquet court there. Dan Slaughter said at one time that he challenged anybody in the state. He put this challenge out to anybody if they could beat him in a game of croquet, he would give them 2 weeks lodging for free. And they said he was never beat. He must have really been a terrific player.
Well, which I mean, croquet. It's an older game, but I remember playing that. My grandma had a set that we would go out and set it up and play. But a bit of an older game.
Dan Slaughter was a member of the Mount Tabor Baptist Church in Paint Lick, and he also had a store in Paint Lick. He also had a store in Muddy Springs over in Madison County, as you head out of Berea towards Jackson County. But so he has a lot of going on. And I said he's married, but his marriage, I guess, like I said, he was like a lot of wealthy men back in those days, kind of a playboy kind of fellow. But anyway, he was at odds with the owner of the property. He never did own the property, and he would lose the lease, and then he would gather it back, and there'd have to be some finagling, just like today. There had to be some finagling. And so in 1890, he said, 1889, he says, I've bought the Kennedy Farm and plan on building a new resort there. Well, the Kennedy Farm is back in Lincoln County, and it is directly across the road from the Hopkins Cemetery where my relatives are. My ancestors would later buy that property. Mm-hmm. But in 1889, he has bought this Kennedy Farm. Well, he decides to build the Greenbrier Springs Resort there. He's tired of this lease issues with Dripping Springs. So he starts building this building, and this building is 400 feet across the front, 400 down 100 down the sides, 400 across the back. So it's 1,000 feet all the way around this building. It sits in a beautiful meadow. There's a beautiful springs there, and it's supposed to have 7 different kinds of water too. And so he gets this built. And in the meantime, he gets his lease back from Dripping Springs. He don't think he wants it back, but I guess they see, well, he's playing hardball. Mm-hmm. So but he decides and he advertises that the Greenbrier Resort will be the place to come to.
Yeah. And
we can still go to Dripping Springs, but it's getting a little run down and things like that. But we can still go to Dripping Springs. But when the Greenbrier was built, he advertised it heavily, and I've got a picture of it. But it was not successful. People did not care for it.
Yeah.
They said it was too hot there. Whereas they said Dripping Springs was the coolest place in the world. It was described as.
Yeah.
There's a preacher from Stanford originally, and I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Barnes, and he was a preacher of some notoriety back in his days. Well, some wealthy people in the Northeast around New York and things heard him on several occasions, and they liked him, and they liked him a lot. And they said, we want you to preach all over the world.
Yeah.
And so Mr. Barnes was taken to Rome. He preached in Rome, Italy. He preached in London. He preached in Australia. He preached all over the world, and he would gather huge followers, about like Billy Graham followers that we have that we're more familiar with. Thousands of people would come. He said, for the record, I believe that Dripping Springs in Garrard County, Kentucky, is the coolest place I've ever been in my life. Now, that's his take on it. But they would have 2,000 or 3,000 people there on a Sunday, and there would be preaching, and then there would be Dan Slaughter would serve big meals, and people certainly staying there. I mentioned a while ago, Dan was a member of the Mount Tabor Baptist Church. And Mount Tabor Baptist Church, like most Baptist churches at that time, they frowned heavily on dancing. And Dan would always chide back and forth. He would put the letters to the editor about how the Mount Tabor Baptist Church was critical of his allowing dancing, but they never rejected the money he put in the play. Things like that. Yeah. And so there was a back and forth. So Dan would not stop the dancing because people came there to dance. And they wanted to dance. And so he would never stop the dancing. And even though it left him at odds sometimes with it. But anyway, by 1890, he started building this Greenbrier Hotel. And like I said, it was not successful. He tried his best to market. It was not successful. But people started flocking back to Dripping Springs. So he refurbished it again, and the crowds continued to come. And the business is booming. Okay. By the 1893, though, trouble has raised its ugly head. And when I said a while ago that Dan was somewhat of a ladies' man, oftentimes, and on more than one occasion, he would put in the paper a damsel he had seen in Lebanon or something like that, and the flirtations he made with her. And he did this publicly. He's on the front page. Well, and the editor of the Stanford paper, the Interior Journal, loved Dan Slaughter.
Yeah.
Why? He's the best customer in the world. You 20,000 12-page flyer. He's the best customer for a printer that you could hope for. But anyway, by September 1893, Dan is involved with a young lady who's visiting Dripping Springs. A young man who lives across the way from a pretty wealthy family named Rodney Singleton, 18 years old. He likes the same girl. He likes the same girl. Well, Dan, of course, is married with children, but that seems to be not an issue. So,
definitely if he's putting it in the front page of the paper.
September 23rd, 1893, Saturday night. Dan has warned Rodney Singleton, do not come back to Dripping Springs. You are not welcome here. Rodney, 18 years old and brash, said, it's a public place. I can come if I want to. So Rodney on this Saturday goes out with some friends and they do some shooting, and he just practiced target shooting stuff his boys were doing in 1893.
Yeah.
And he gets down. He's got 2 bullets left, and he tells his friends. He said, "I'm going to keep a couple bullets. You never know when you might need one." Okay. So Rodney goes home, gets dressed, cleaned up, and dressed in tails. Which coat has tails like a formal jacket would be, you know. So he goes to Dripping Springs. He sees the girl, and they start talking again. And she likes him, and I think she likes both guys. She's probably playing both of them. But anyway, as you walked around the porch of Dripping Springs, like I said, you could encircle the whole thing on either floor. As you walked around, the doors were recessed about 18 inches. And so Dan is aware of what's going on, and he's furious. He hides himself in the darkened recess of one of those doors. Rodney and this young lady come strolling by on the porch, arm in arm. Dan jumps out from behind them and jumps on Rodney's back, wraps his arm around his neck, and with, as Daddy said, my daddy described it as a pike. It's not a cutting knife, it is a stabbing knife.
Yeah.
And it's used in war. And he stabbed Rodney, and I think he stabbed him 15 times. And I have seen the coat. I have no idea where it got to, but I have seen the long-tailed coat and the knife cuts in the back of it. My daddy's sister married into the Singleton family, and they had that coat at one time, but I think it got destroyed in flood, different ways. But anyway, I've seen that coat, and I have cousins that have seen it, that can testify. So Dan jumps on Rodney, and the girl runs away, and so he stabs him 15 times. Well, Rodney's holding him on his back, trying to dislodge him, and they stagger into the ballroom.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody's horrified of what they're witnessing, and all of a sudden, Rodney just collapses under the weight and the loss of blood. As he's laying there in the floor, Dan gathers himself and turns to walk out, after this horrific deed. And Rodney says, "Dan, you've killed me." And Dan turns and looks back. He can't believe what he's hearing. He stabbed him 15 times.
Yeah.
And Rodney has pulled the pistol, and he shoots twice, and shoots Dan Slaughter in the throat.
Wow.
In the throat. And he shot him in the throat because Dan Slaughter wore a bulletproof vest, and he knew that he was wearing that bulletproof vest, and so his aim was perfect.
Wow.
While laying there, Rodney died then as soon as he fired the shots.
Yeah.
They summoned a doctor. We went to Crab Orchard, got a doctor, and they brought him, and the doctor said that there's no hope for Dan to survive. He cannot survive. And he lived into Monday from the 2 shots in the throat.
Yeah.
He lived to Monday. Well,
Wow.
at that point, that really put a damper on things, okay?
Yeah.
And,
Understandably so.
Understandably so. So that leaves his wife and 4 little kids trying to run these places, and they can't. They simply cannot do it. So in 1901, the Greenbrier Springs property, which had never been successful, she was finally able to get rid of it. And then Dripping Springs is on its downward spiral too. They give up the lease on it, and different people would run it. It's been advertised in 1906 it's for sale. Dan Slaughter's had a sister named Katie, and she married a McKinney, and she wrote a book called The Silent Witness. And in 1907, it says The Silent Witness book is selling well. It's based upon life in and around the Dripping Springs neighborhood. And that was in 1907. I have a copy of that book. I was able to buy it on Amazon.
Oh, I
at
was
the
about to
time.
say, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll let you read that, okay? And so S.D. Rothwell and his Mr. and Miss Rothwell bought this property in November 8th, 1913. And so then their son, Mort Rothwell, an attorney, he was killed at Crab Orchard in 1914. But anyway, these are just people that had relationships with Dripping Springs. But by 1919, November 21st, 1919, my grandfather, Ewell Hopkins, along with his wife, they had migrated to Lincoln County, just across the creek, in 1909. So after living here 10 years, they bought 13.95 acres at Dripping Springs, and they gave $2,300 for it. And so my grandfather and his family, his burgeoning family, moved across the creek into Garrard County. Okay, so they would live there, and then for many, many years. And my daddy would be born there in 1926, and they fixed the place up. And my grandfather rented rooms for 2 or 3 years, but then finally the buildings were getting becoming dilapidated. He tore them down.
Yeah.
And so they had a big house there and barns and things like that. But the hotel business was done. Now Jane Haselden said what really caused the demise of the places like Dripping Springs was the automobile. Because used to, you were restricted in your travel. You could go as far as a horse and buggy, and your servant driver could take you. But she said in 1910, Mr. Haselden, J.R. Haselden, this is a remarkable story. He became friend. He sold buggies and buggy tops and things such as that. So he goes to a convention I think it's in Chicago, from Lancaster, and he wants to see what he could buy, for his hardware. He really had outstanding hardware business. He hooks up with Henry Ford, and Henry Ford encouraged him to take the car dealership for Kentucky and all the states that surround it. Of course, this is just the infancy of the car business, and he did not want to do that, but he did take he was authorized to sell the Ford cars in Kentucky, in Garrard County, and the counties that surrounded it. He did central Kentucky pretty much. But he comes home from this convention in 1910, and he had purchased a Model T car. It was red. Henry Ford would later decide all my cars will be black.
Yeah.
But this time,
wow.
So they shipped it by train to Lancaster, Kentucky in 1910. And it was in a boxcar, and so when it gets to Lancaster, nobody can drive it because nobody's ever driven it. So Mr. House, a very smart man, and he has a black man that worked for him that ran the threshing machine. So between the two of them, they read the manual, and of course they rolled it off the train. That was not a problem. But then they read the manual, and so they got the little red car started up, and while the car was waiting to be delivered, Mr. Haselden had his workers build a garage for it. He wanted to park his car in the garage. Well, in the back of the garage, he added on a playroom for his daughter, Jane.
Yeah.
So he added a playroom for Jane. So he gets the car, and after a couple days, they figure out how to drive it. He does. So he drives it just across town to his house. And as he goes into his garage, his brand new garage, he don't stop, and he goes right through the little playhouse to the back of the garage and the playhouse. Thankfully, Jane was not in it, and no one was injured. But the braking and all this was all brand new.
Yeah.
But Jane said the first time, of course, she said she remembers distinctly on the weekends, on Friday evening, her daddy would get off work at Lancaster from the hardware store. He would come roaring out of the creek after the 21st fording of the creek, the Fawley Creek, and then he would drive up 500 yards onto the Dripping Springs Hotel in this red Model T, which had to be like a spaceship back in those days.
Yeah.
The little kids all there would run and jump on the running boards and the fenders. He would stop and let them hop on there and ride them the last 200 or 300 yards, but she said with the coming of the automobile came the demise of these little places, because the automobile gave people the freedom to go to bigger and better and fancier places. Yes.
Bigger towns, bigger cities.
And so that Dripping Springs, like all the other places, like Crab Orchard Springs and like I said, Bath, over in Bath County, and different places like that. Mount Rockcastle had Rockcastle County Springs. There were springs in McKinney, Kentucky. There's springs everywhere. They were on their way out.
Yeah. Yeah.
that would run their way out.
It is crazy to think about getting a car and having to look at the manual to figure out how to work it. I mean, it's just. I mean, it's no different than getting out a drone or something. I'm gonna have to look at the manual to figure out how to fly the drone. But 100 years ago, it was a car that you had to figure out. How are we gonna get this? I bought this thing. I don't know how to operate it. That's pretty funny, pretty impressive. But
Dripping Springs, as growing up as children, we camped on top of that big hill many times, and you could see the remnants of the croquet court. You could see the remnants of the little buildings that had been built there, era of stuff from time gone past,
Yeah.
But now, if you drive to Dripping Springs, you won't notice it. There's a sharp curve that leads you around, and there it sits, and it sits magnificently. And there's a beautiful open meadow down there below it that's grown up. It's muddy where the water comes out continuously, and it's not ditched properly, and you'll get your car dirty, you'll get your shoes dirty, and you could get snake bit.
Yeah.
But it's still there, but it still floats.
You can't see it from 39, can you? Or is it?
No, you have to drive it.
Okay.
Yeah. It's probably 4 miles from 39.
Okay.
4 miles from 39.
Well, I'm trying to picture. So if you're going down 39 through, Preachersville, you get to Garrard. Where do you go from there?
No, you don't ever do that.
You don't ever
As
get
soon
there?
as you leave Crab Orchard, you go down Tollgate Hill, straight,
Okay.
and you cross Dix River.
Yeah.
And as soon as you cross Dix River, there's Highway 3246
Mm-hmm.
that turns to your right. You turn on Highway 3246 and you drive until it stops. You cross. You cross Follet Creek, and you cross Follet Creek twice. But the second time you cross it, you have to stop. You either have to turn right or you turn left. As soon as you cross the creek, you're in Garrard County. When you turn left, you drive down a couple hundred yards and make a big 90-degree turn, and you turn your way back up, and then Dripping Springs will be sitting there to your right.
Yeah.
And I'd be glad to show it to you sometime.
Yeah. That'd be
There's
cool.
an old cemetery that's on the hill located behind it, and this is a fascinating thing to me, nobody knows it's there.
Mm-hmm.
There's very few people know it's there. We have it marked on maps and stuff like that, so people won't be totally lost. But Rodney Singleton, like I said, 18 years old, from an affluent family, he's buried there. And so I asked his family one time, I said, why does Rodney not have a stone? Because that's odd.
Yeah.
And they said he did have a stone. But they said grave robbers years ago stole several tombstones from that cemetery. What they did with them. But they stole the tombstones. And so all the stones there are just field rocks.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's not but Rodney Singleton is one of the people that's buried there, along with some of his ancestors that are buried there, and other people as well. But it's on the hill, up on the knoll, and behind Dripping Springs.
Yeah.
My daddy's family, like I said, grew up there. All the kids, they worked there, around, and they had the best asset in the world, which was that unlimited amount of running water,
Wow.
Which most people did not have.
Yeah.
There was a family around the road from them in the 1920s. I read about that 4 different family members died from typhoid fever. They were drinking contaminated water, and not only did they drink the contaminated water, they didn't mean to do that, of course, but they did. They did not believe in doctors.
Oh.
They believed in home remedies, and they simply died. 4 of the people out of the family of 6 or 8.
Wow.
And then once.
Which shows you how important it was to have good drinking water and all that stuff.
And of course, my grandparents, and my grandfather then, as his health began to decline, he developed severe rheumatoid arthritis. He was 42 years old in 1925. A few years later, he sold it to his daughter Molly. Mm-hmm. She was married to a man named Will Hopkins, who was actually her cousin. But anyway, they lived there for several years, and the place was immaculate. I mean, they kept it spotless. And when my mother married Daddy in 1952, she said you could have eaten off the floor, Dripping Springs. And it was just a big roomy cavern you walked into with these troughs full of all kinds of good things, fresh water, just an abundance of fresh water. Anybody that stopped and wanted water, they gave them as much as they wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, if you wanted to stop by and get 2 or 3 gallons of water, they're happy to give it to you. But we got it. Otherwise, it's just rolling away like it is. So it was a godsend for those people, and So they were very blessed in that regard.
Yeah. Anything else before to wrap it up?
I think that pretty much does. I'll just say one other thing, that by the time the Dripping Springs ends in 1922, most municipalities and cities have got running water by the early 1900s. So it became less of an issue. You didn't have to go to someplace different for healing waters. You had good fresh water there, and you were just at your kitchen sink. And that's pretty much it. It's a fascinating history of Dripping Springs, and it was a good place for Daddy to grow up. He said they would go cut hog weeds to feed the hogs, and every time they went, they would swim in the creek at Follett Creek, which is 300 yards away. And then he said their mother would holler for him, and then he and his brothers would rush back and do some more chores, and then go back to the creek. They would go 5 or 6 times a day for brief interludes, And it had to be fun and refreshing, And because a lot of people didn't have access to that. But it's a good place for Daddy to grow up, and I've known about it my whole life, and I'm glad it's still flowing, and I hope it always will. Yeah.
Well, I mean, talk about playing in the creek. We had a creek down the road from our house. We ran down there quite often and just played in the creek. Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us. I think it's a pretty accurate description of the times, and I'm sure as we continue looking around in different counties and places, there's be some parallels to places like Dripping Springs and so forth. Even right down the road at Crab Orchard Springs, same kind of story, same kind of situation. But thanks again for coming and talking to us, and thanks again for listening. See you next time.